evening. And welcome to Q&A live from the Edge Theatre in Melbourne. I'm Tony Jones, answering your questions tonight in this special Melbourne Writers' Festival edition of Q&A. Free marketeer and columnist Chris Bird, the editor of Breakfast Politics and a biographer of Julia Gillard, Christine Wallace, former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, Prime Ministerial daughter and author of Campaign Ruby, Jessica Rudd, and the author of The Life and Death of Democracy, John Keane. Please welcome our panellists. Okay, Q&A is live from 9:40 Eastern Time. You can send your questions by SMS to 1975522 or via our website abc.net.au/Quanda, Q&A. And join the Twitter conversation using the Quanda hashtag that's on your screen at the moment. Well, with an audience of 300 literary lovers, a distinguished panel and politics in limbo, there's a lot of questions to ask. Let's go to our very first one tonight, which comes from Kaz Hall.
Australia's immediate political future is in the hands of three rural independents who are asking for a range of promises to be made without a mandate from the rest of Australia. Their motives are clearly to protect. Is it time for both sides of the political spectrum to take the hard decision to go back to the polls and ask for a mandate to govern from the Australian?
Okay, we had a few sound problems there, but is it time, essentially, Australia's political future is in the hands of three rural independents. They've got a range of promises. They don't have a mandate from the rest of Australia. They're clearly trying to protect their own interests. Is it time for both sides of the political spectrum to take the hard decision and go back to the polls and ask for a mandate to govern from the Australian people? Malcolm Fraser, is it time to go back to the polls?
No, not yet. It may be possible to form a stable government, although the problems in front of that, I think, are very great. We don't know what the so-called demands of the rural independents are. They seem to have a fairly diverse agenda. And there's also, it hasn't had all that much publicity perhaps, but the complexity that whatever government is established, if one is established, the Greens will be in charge of the Senate from next July. So you can have something that might work till July, but will it work after July? We just don't know what the demands are, and I think it's quite impossible to make firm, sensible judgments yet.
You've heard Andrew Wilkie, the other independent, say that they're behaving like a political party with three factions. I mean, can you make a deal under those circumstances?
Well, it'll be difficult. I mean, the Italians have tried to do this, and you could say in some sense that Italy has been a very successful country without a government for over 50 years. They've got a good reserve bank, really solid, and their economic performance ever since the Second World War, which was mostly before you were born, certainly probably a lot of you born after I left the Parliament, Italy's economic performance, design performance, production performance, productivity has been way ahead of Britain's. Most people would say Britain's had a good government and Italy has not.
Okay, well, let's go to Jessica Rudd now. Apparently we don't need government, according to Malcolm Fraser, that's unified. What do you think? Is it time to go back to the polls?
Well, I think that the fact that we don't have people protesting in the streets, despite the fact that we don't have a government, means that most Australians are probably thinking to themselves, go to your room, sort it out, guys, you know. We're just a bit over having elections at the moment. And I think these independents are cool people. I've been listening to what a number of them have had to say, and I think we're in pretty safe hands. Bob Catter certainly had the best ad of the entire election campaign, so...
Yes, indeed he does. Jessica, the last part of the question, though, is it time to go back to the polls for a mandate to govern? What do you think about that?
I don't think so yet. I mean, I think that we need to give these people a chance to get their house in order, so to speak.
Okay, they're about to buzz us in a helicopter, but Chris Berg, assuming they don't come too low, what do you think?
Yeah, I think one thing we may learn out of this hung parliament is just how good it can be without a government for some time. In Belgium, they had a hung parliament for something like 8 months, and the government just keeps working. The government, we still have a government, and we still have a prime minister to make, you know, foreign policy decisions and national security decisions, all these sorts of things. But they can't stuff it up. They can't make the country much better. but they can't damage it in any way. And if you guys were happy with the election promises on the table this election, then, well, maybe you do want a government. But if you were dissatisfied with them, then this is probably not a bad place for us to be in.
Christine.
There's one big thing that's kind of gone unrecognised with this election, and that is that probably historically the best prediction of election outcomes is who people think is going to win. And overwhelmingly, all the quality polling showed and all the betting markets showed right up to election day that people overwhelmingly expected a Gillard government to be returned. Now, I think that kind of freed up people to poll protest votes at a rate that, you know, was pretty much unprecedented. And I think many of the people who did it did not expect even remotely the possibility of an Abbott government. And I think, in fact, this is the strongest argument for an early return to the polls, that I think if you had an election today, the protest vote level would be so much lower because of that, and I think Julia Gillard would be fairly comfortably returned.
We just heard Tony Abbott buzzing us in the helicopter there. He obviously didn't like what you're saying. Let's hear from John Keane. What do you think, John?
Well, it's day 9 in the big Australia election house. And, the cheeky cheerfulness of Australians has kicked in. And I think millions of people are actually enjoying this interregnum. We have, what a show. Big Bob Kennedy Catter. We have a New Englander named Tony Windsor who says that he's proud of escaping 2 cancers recently, giving up smoking and abandoning the Nationals. And there is even a dissident National from the seat of O'Connor in Western Australia, about whom there's not been much discussion. A man who says he's going to sit on the crossbenches and unhappily is named Tony Crook. And I hear in Sydney lots of jokes going on about Wingnut, that's Tony Abbott. And I hear comments about Julia Gillard's inability to pronounce Mr. Rabbit in any other way than that. But there is a serious side. I agree very much with Christine that this is a period in which I would say we're all living in suspended animation. And in a way, Australia is conducting its own election monitoring exercise. We've learned what a staged, managed, issueless election can lead to. We see finally that federal politics has joined the Brits and the Canadians and New Zealand in a hung parliament. I think it's clear that there are some things that are not good in the system, and I think we're beginning to see that some reforms are necessary. So it's not bad that it goes on for probably another week.
John, you missed one other indication of just how hard this is going to be getting the independents on side. Bob Catter said today, we won't be drawing any lines in the sand, but we will be indicating where the lines in the sand are going to be drawn.
Let's go. Well, that's probably in advance from talking about the price of milk as a condition of a national government.
All right, let's go to second question of the night. It comes from Bill McIntosh.
The coalition has the highest primary vote, and Labor has the highest two-party preferred vote. Given the same number of seats, which party should be given the first opportunity to form government with the independents?
Malcolm Fraser, do you want to start us off there? It's a constitutional issue.
The two-party preferred vote, there have often been governments that have not had a majority of the two-party preferred vote or a majority of the primary vote. And it is the number of seats that actually count. If the seats are equal, convention suggests very strongly that the incumbent would be given the first chance to form a government. And if the incumbent can't, then that's where the Governor-General, or in Britain the monarch, would look around to see who else is offering, willing and able to try.
Malcolm, I've got to ask, how do you work out the count? Because at 73, the coalition has to rely on an independent national from Western Australia who wants to sit on the crossbenches. And at 73, Labor could say they have a Green MP on their side. So that could be 73 all, if you look at it that way.
Well, if it's 73 all, then Labor should be given the first chance to form a government.
Would you accept 73 all under those circumstances? It's obviously you have to add a Green on one side and an independent national on the other. You
might need to have some discussions with the Green and the independent national. how independent is this national? Is he really going to be on the crossbenches? Is he going to be a quasi-national? I think there's a lot that we still don't know.
I think you're right about that. Christine Wallace.
Well, whoever forms government, whomever gets to do it, and yes, you're quite right, Malcolm, probably Julia Gillard will get the first opportunity to do that. But you've got to ask yourself whether this is one of those horrible elections, much like Barack Obama faced. It could be the election that's good not to win. Whoever forms government is going to face the horrendous situation of being perpetually hostage to the whims of unpredictable independent candidates. And look, Bob Katter is a terrific bloke. 97% of the time, 3% of the time, well, you know, he's a firecracker. If Tony Abbott or Julia Gillard's future rests on the stability of support from that bunch of independents, I think we're in for a very interesting time. And, you know, boy, I'd be putting $1,000 on an election sooner or later, whomever gets to form government in the next few weeks.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because that's why the independents are emphasising we want whichever government we choose to put into power, we want them to stay the full 3 years. Because if they don't get that guarantee, as far as there can be a guarantee, then it's going to fall apart pretty quickly the moment whoever is holding the balance of power, Bob Katter or something like that, comes up with a proposal that the party just cannot agree to. By getting that guarantee that that the party will last the full term, or with the same leader will last the full term, they're locking in 3 years of potential pork barrelling and dodgy electorate deals for themselves.
Just come back to the question, though. Who do you think gets the first chance to form government? Do you accept the figures of being roughly 73 all? Or?
Yeah, sure. But no one gets a first chance to form government. It's whoever can hold power in the House. And for as long as they can. I don't think there's any... we've talked a lot about who won the two-party preferred and those sorts of figures. I don't think that gives a party any moral right to govern. It's whoever can hold power on the House. That's how the system works. It doesn't have any particular moral value other than that.
John Keane, you've watched elections now in two countries in a very short time, Britain and here. I mean, what do you think of this kind of hair-splitting exercise?
Well, I have a different view, I think, about hung parliaments and the possibility of minority governments. In Australian history, until 1910, we were governed under hung parliament conditions. We had the first Labour government, national Labour government in the world in 1904, a half Chilean Australian. We had arguably the most successful and most popular government, John Curtin, during World War II, on that basis, who went on to win a thumping majority, I think, in 1943. And we have local state examples. Every state has had an experience of this. Steve Bracks, at the end of the 90s, struck a charter of good governance and actually introduced some really important legislation. High-speed rail, a religious and racial toleration act, and went on to actually get rid of the three independents upon whom he depended and won a very substantial majority. Actually, the experience around the world is this is a pretty normal situation. So I think, of course, much depends on what happens this week. It would be daft to form a government, to go to the House of Representatives to try to win the right to govern without a 3-year agreement and a very clear deal about the really substantial policies that will matter during the coming decade or two. Otherwise, we're all in trouble, and we will go back to the polls. And I can feel, from the grassroots that there is a lot of resistance to doing that. And I think it's a very dangerous path, and I hope both the independents and the two leaders of the two major parties understand that. Of course, the Greens are a key to the resolution of this.
Right, we'll come and talk more about them later. Jessica Rudd, what's your thought? Who should get the first opportunity under the circumstances outlined by the questioner to form government?
Well, I accept that the incumbent deserves to have that opportunity if it comes down to that. What an exciting few years it's going to be for you guys, Tony. I mean, covering that kind of a parliament would be so exciting. You never know what will happen every day.
But how many novels are there in it for you?
I know. What a great time to be a writer. Seriously. It's just going to be a fascinating few years.
Okay, let's go to our next question. It comes from Zoe Jones.
Mr. Fraser. What legacy does the dismissal of the Whitlam government have on today's parliamentary democracy? And in particular, what do you see as the role for the Governor-General in resolving the hung parliament?
The role of the Governor-General is largely governed by precedent. The incumbent, if the incumbent has an equal or more votes, not two-party preferred, but more seats than anyone else. If somebody else has more seats, they should get the first chance. Now, this is largely governed by practice and precedent in the past. Not only our past, but British past also. 1975 doesn't have any relationship to it at all. Different circumstances, different times. I suspect before you were born, and nobody wants to relive that. 5 years, 10 years, 15, 25, 30, 35, every anniversary.
Hang on for 1 second, we'll get a microphone too. Sorry about that.
The breaking of convention, but it wasn't breaking convention, because the convention that mattered was that if a government cannot get its money bills through the Parliament and cannot pay its bills, and the government couldn't do that, the Treasury had been required to construct phony certificates forcing the banks to pay their bills, which would have been totally illegal. If a government can't get its budget through, then that government either resigns or recommends that somebody else forms a government.
And
the one before that.
But they couldn't get it through because of you.
Of course, because of us. But if you can't get it through, there is no obligation on an opposition to support a budget in the circumstances that prevailed, and an overwhelming majority of Australians demonstrated that. All we were asking for was an election. And in the foreword to somebody's book, a British jurist, Lord Hailsham, wrote that Mr. Whitlam was rather a lucky man. All he did was lose an election. The previous person who tried to govern without the approval of Parliament, I always forget whether it was Charles I or II, but he lost his head.
Okay, Gough Whitlam, if you're listening out there, don't worry, it's too late to lose your head. This is Q&A, the live and interactive show. We're going to move on from history. I know you didn't want him to lose his head. We're going to allow other people to ask questions. Go to our website if you want to find out how to join the studio audience and ask a question like Matthew Lesh.
President Bartlett in the West Wing once said, "It's not our job to cater to the lowest common denominator. It's our job to raise it." Why is the opposite currently true within Australian politics?
Okay, in case anyone missed the beginning, President Bartlett in the West Wing once said, "It's not our job to cater to the lowest common denominator, it's our job to raise it." Why isn't that true in Australian politics? Jessica Rudd, you're a West Wing fan, I think.
I am a die-hard West Wing fan, and I can think of nothing better to do, so I think that's an awesome question, Matthew. I think that we face a challenge in modern democracies, and that is about making sure that we are getting our messages across and getting them across clearly to everybody. But also, politicians must step up to the task of saying what they believe. And that's a really difficult balance, because you need to be getting your message out there, and you need it to appeal to as many people as possible. And sometimes what you believe can slip. It happens in my book. There's a point at which the opposition leader is faced with a particularly difficult policy area, and he has to decide on whether he is going to pursue that his position, which I believe is the right position on immigration policy, or whether he is going to appeal to the lowest common denominator. He decides very strongly that he is going to go with his belief. That doesn't always happen.
Is it only in fiction that political leaders rise above the lowest common denominator?
Well, this is the beauty about the West Wing, isn't it, Matthew? And, you know, we sit there going, oh, if only President Bartlett was ours. You know, it's fantastic, fantastic viewing.
John Keane.
Well, I think Matthew's question is really critical, and I think it's one of the things we're thinking about on day 9 after this hung election. I would say that there are some structural reasons, to use professorial speak, for why you feel that, and you're not the only one. I think that politics in Australia, as in other democracies, has come to be governed by focus groups, by the concentration on marginals, by the throwing of media bombs, stop the boats, national tragedy of abortion. It has also come to be, I think, heavily dependent on absent voters. You know, we have 1.4 million estimated people, citizens, who are not actually registered and not voting. And when you add to this the cocooning that goes on in politics at the top and the loss of reality, you get this bizarre stage performance that, you know, most audiences would boo. I mean, I'm old enough to say that I was born in the year of Chifley's The Light on the Hill speech. You know, this election campaign, there was no light, it was all darkness, there were no hills, it was all on the flats.
John, I'm going to interrupt you because we've actually got another question before I bring the other panellists in to talk about this. Very similar question. It's from the audience, from Santa Pastricia.
We've just suffered an election where it seemed the entire message from both parties was directed to just a few 100,000 voters in New South Wales and Queensland. And the message seemed to assume that voters were predominantly xenophobic, selfish and disengaged. Now that both parties have lost their mandate and the fate of our parliament is in the hands of rural independents and minor parties who seem far more progressive and creative, my question is, how can voters encourage their politicians to catch up with their more creative views?
Malcolm Fraser. Interesting, isn't it, that that's the first question to get a spontaneous round of applause. It must be hitting a chord out there.
Well, I think it does hit a chord, and it's a very good thing that it does. But it's also important to look at what's wrong and what is not so wrong. Some people are starting to say, all right, we can fix some of this with some structural changes. Maybe the way Question Time works, maybe the way the Senate works, the relationships between the two. The sad thing about a democracy is that really good politicians can make a lousy system work extraordinarily well. And if the politicians, the people, are not adequate, they can destroy a really good system. I think Australia's probably got one of the dozen best democracies in the world in terms of structure and fabric. Sure, we can all think of some ways it might be improved. But the kinds of changes that I've seen talked about over the last few days aren't going to do anything to lead to better government. I mean, why wouldn't people talk about something that was important to the future of Australia? What influence do we want Australia to have? Do we continue to want Australia to behave like a puppy dog to America, or do we believe that Australia should have a sense of independence? Still keep ANZUS, we can do that, but we can still be independent and do some things in our own right. Important things were not discussed. It's the minutiae that were discussed that might be important to a particular region or a particular group of people. And that gets back to the people running our politics. Now, how does somebody like George Williams, a most eminent QC in Sydney, a very experienced lawyer, get beaten for pre-selection in the Labor Party by a staffer whom I must admit I don't know, by a junior staffer from somebody who was then in the opposition, front bench opposition.
You're talking about the dominance of the Labor Party machine in
well, it was a machine, but the Liberal Party machine is now exactly the same. If you look at the candidates who are chosen, they're mostly what I call apparatchiks. You go to university, you decide you want a political career. Now, which party should I join? Who do I know in this party? Who do I know in that party? Who's the most senior? Where can I get a job? Can I get a job back with the organisation? They've never done anything else. The Parliament needs people who've achieved something in their own right, who've done things in their own right, who know what the real world is, and who can contribute. Not people who will be beholden to a particular, more senior political benefactor or beholden to their head office.
Christine Wallace, I'll get you to bring in. There's a gentleman with his hand up down there. We'll get a microphone to you. We'll come to you in a moment. Hang on. Christine.
Look, there's a lot in what you say, Malcolm, but there's also an element of they were giants in our days, I think. There's a general feeling that this was just a disastrously high-carb election when people want a high-protein politics in Australia. And the symbol of that, I think, is what happened to climate change policy. The thing that really I do not understand about this election is why federal Labor, which is, a pretty brainy bunch of people, pretty professional machine behind it, did not satisfy the big yearning hunger for a serious, understandable, credible, meaty, effective climate change policy. Now, when you look at how Labor kind of has derailed over the last couple of years, it's because there was the biggest moral challenge of our time, then Copenhagen fell in a heap, then there was a 6-month interregnum, and then there was this basically a vacuum on climate change policy, late Rudd and through to Gillard. As a result, there's been this gigantic swing to the Greens, and there was credible polling out today showing that 1/3 of the people who voted Green this election, and there were over 1.15 million of them who voted Green, 1/3 of those people would have voted Labor had there been a credible climate policy. Now, you don't need to be a genius to work out if there'd been one, the Gillard government would have been comfortably returned.
But that means you need people who will stand for the issue, won't listen to the focus groups, will say, right, it'll be difficult to persuade Australians that this is the policy that Australia needs, but who will go there against the odds and change the focus groups around, change the polls around, simply because the arguments are on their side. And this has been done in the past in Australia.
I think we can overcomplicate it, and I think there's a big danger that the politicians have lost their ears, far from being too focus group driven. There's a big screaming message from this election for both sides of politics from voters. It's, we are unhappy with you. It is offer us better policies, and most of all, offer us something serious on climate change policy. It's all not right. Brain surgery.
Okay, I want to hear from Chris Berg, and then we'll go to that questioner who had his hand up a moment ago.
It was amazing how quickly things unravelled. Just in late 2009, we were watching the Liberal Party seemingly unravel and collapse into itself, and we were sure that Labor was going to cement its dominance for at least a decade. People were talking, I remember in late 2007 after the election, people were talking about, could this be the end of the Liberal Party? In 2009, they were saying, could the Liberal Party split? Could it all collapse? But it all fell apart just in a couple of months, really. As we say, it started with Copenhagen when Kevin Rudd failed to get the agreement that he was really relying on, and then probably failed to go to a double dissolution in January, February, and everybody lost their edge. But back in 2009, when the ETS was about to go to a vote, they were one vote off in the Liberal Party room from getting that policy passed. That would have gone through the Parliament. That would have been a massive success for Kevin Rudd and the Labor Party. And we wouldn't be talking as we do now. We wouldn't be talking as if, well, this is the end of Labor and this is the end of politics as we see it. I think we're reading too much meaning almost into the collapse of Labor and Liberal support in the last year.
All right. Advice for the Labor Party from where you least expect it. Let's hear from this questioner down here.
I wonder if the panel hasn't missed an important point in all this, which is that in the last 6 decades, only the Hawke Labor government managed to form a stable and working government. Isn't the true critique and the true lesson from this election that modern Labor is incapable of national leadership?
Let's hear from John Keane on that.
That, by the way, reminds me of Bob Hawke's favourite joke, which is the story of the terrible accident on the Hume Highway linking Melbourne and Sydney. 2 bodies mashed up, the forensics are called in. There are skid marks before one, and the forensics figure out that the skid marks of the kangaroo, the other figure was a politician. That was Bob Hawke's favourite joke. I mean, I'm not sure about that. I happen to think that Chris is wrong about this. I think this is a black swan moment in Australian politics. I think that we're at the end of the road of staged, managed two-party politics. It has collapsed in every other Westminster model. This is the last one where it has collapsed. And more than that, I think we are at the end of Labour-style politics, not only in machine terms, but I think the naive belief in progress, industrial progress, and the attachment to high-carbon industrial growth, I think that's coming to an end. And I think the Green vote, which Christine has rightly emphasised, is huge and potentially much bigger than the Democrats' vote, is the canary in the mine shaft, to mix metaphors. I think it's a sign of something, of a tectonic shift that's happening. And I would say that it's also putting on the agenda the need for big visions of Australia in the future. And it's either backward-looking or it's multicultural, within Asia, low carbon, a small player that's powerful in the world because of our ability to speak openly to our friends. That's a big vision that I think has been put on the table. We didn't hear anything of that during the election. That's the tragedy of it.
Okay. This is Q&A, the program that gives you the chance to ask the questions. The next question comes from Julia Henkel.
Jessica, your father's experienced the highs and lows of political life over a very short period of time. How has this affected you, your family and your father, and would you consider entering a politics life?
Well, it has been a tricky period for my family and I. I'm not going to deny that. It's been very difficult at times, but we're doing okay. I think worse things have happened to better people. And I'm sort of getting on with, I've written this book